Welcome. Let yourself settle into comfort now. Pull your blanket closer, adjust your pillow, and allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm. Tonight we journey not to a battlefield or a bustling marketplace, but to one of the quietest corners of medieval Europa's scriptorium, where the only sounds are the gentle scrape of quill against parchment and the whisper of turning pages. Imagine yourself in a world without keyboards, without printing presses, without the hum of electronics. In this world, every book, every prayer, every legal document must be written by hand, letter by letter, word by word, page by page. This is the domain of the medieval scribe, a figure whose days unfold in deliberate silence, whose labor is measured not in dramatic gestures, but in the smallest movements of the wrist, the steadiest control of breath, the most patient attention to detail. The scribes we will visit tonight worked primarily in monasteries, though some served in royal courts or episcopal households. They were the custodians of knowledge, the preservers of sacred texts, the reproducers of classical wisdom. Their work required years of training, endless patience, and a tolerance for cold that most of us can scarcely imagine. They sat for hours in stone rooms, their fingers stiff with winter chill, their eyes straining in candlelight, creating manuscripts that would outlive them by centuries. This is not a story of conquest or discovery. There are no dramatic turning points, no moments of sudden revelation. Instead, we will explore the rhythm of their days, the preparation of materials, the careful formation of each letter, the grinding of pigments for illumination, the corrections and erasures that were part of their endless routine. We will feel the weight of their concentration, the burden of their responsibility, and the strange satisfaction that came from completing a single perfect page. So breathe deeply now. Let the modern world recede. We are moving backward through time, to a place where silence was not empty, but full of purpose, full of devotion, full of the quiet determination that characterized these patient artisans of the written word. The morning begins before dawn, as all monastic mornings do. The bell for matins has already rung, its iron voice echoing through the cold corridors of the monastery. You have risen from your narrow bed in the dormitory, your breath visible in the frigid air, and joined your brothers in the chapel for the first prayers of the day. The stone floor beneath your sandaled feet holds the chill of winter, and the darkness beyond the windows is absolute. But now, as the sky begins to lighten, though the sun will not clear the monastery walls for another hour, you make your way to the scriptorium. This is your true work, the labor that defines your days and will define your life. You are a scribe, and this room is where you will spend most of your waking hours for years to come. Perhaps for decades, perhaps until your hands grow too unsteady and your eyes too dim to continue. The scriptorium is a long rectangular chamber on the monastery's south side, positioned to capture whatever sunlight the season offers. Large windows, glazed with expensive glass or covered with oiled parchment, line one wall. In summer, these windows might be open to catch a breeze. In winter, and it is winter now, deep winter, they remain sealed against the wind that howls across the monastery grounds. Still, the cold seeps in. It always does. Stone walls hold the cold as stubbornly as they hold their shape. You enter quietly. Others are already at their desks. The scriptorium accommodates perhaps 8 or 10 scribes, though not all positions are always filled. Some brothers work on temporary assignments, copying a specific text before returning to other duties. Others, like yourself, are permanent fixtures here, dedicating their entire monastic lives to this patient labor. The room smells of parchment and ink, of beeswax candles and cold stone. There is a faint mustiness from the stored materials rolls of prepared vellum, pots of oak gall ink, small leather bags containing pigments for illumination. The floor is swept clean, as it must be kept, for any dirt or debris might find its way onto a manuscript page, ruining hours of work. Your desk awaits. It is not a desk in the modern sense, but rather a slanted writing surface, angled to catch the light and to position the work at a comfortable height. Some scribes work standing at tall desks, but most sit on simple wooden stools or benches, back straight, feet planted firmly on the cold floor. Your desk is smooth from years of use, its wood worn pale in the center where countless hands have rested. Before you begin copying, there is preparation. Always preparation. A scribe does not simply sit down and start writing. The tools must be readied, the materials arranged, the workspace organized with the precision that this work demands. First, your quill. You keep several prepared quills in a wooden box, each cut from the flight feathers of geese or swans. The best quills come from the outer wing feathers, hollow yet sturdy, with a natural curve that fits comfortably in the hand. You select one now, examining its point. The neeb must be sharp, cut at a precise angle to create the thick and thin strokes that characterize the script you use, probably a Gothic textualis, the formal bookhand that has become standard for sacred texts. You take up your penknife. Every scribe carries a small, sharp knife and carefully reshape the nib. This is a task you will repeat many times throughout the day, for quills dull quickly. The scraping sound of the blade against the quill's horn is one of the familiar sounds of the scriptorium, along with the clearing of throats and the occasional shuffle of feet. Speech is forbidden here during working hours. The rule of silence must be maintained. If you need to communicate with a fellow scribe, you must use gestures or wait until the designated times for conversation. Your ink sits in a small ceramic pot, stoppered with a cork to prevent evaporation. You remove the stopper carefully. Ink is valuable, made from oak galls crushed and boiled with iron salts and gum arabic. The mixture must be prepared in large batches and aged properly, a task usually assigned to one of the younger monks learning the scribe's trade. The ink is black, deep black, permanent. When properly made, it will remain legible for centuries. Before you use the manuscript, you are copying an exemplar, a master copy from which you will produce your reproduction. Today, like most days, you are working on a book of hours, a prayer book for private devotion that a wealthy patron has commissioned. The exemplar rests on a stand to your left, positioned where you can consult it easily without moving your writing hand. To your right, weighted down with smooth stones to keep it flat, is your working surface, a large sheet of prepared vellum. Vellum is calfskin, specially treated and stretched to create a smooth, durable writing surface. It is expensive. A single Bible might require the skins of 300 calves. Because of this cost, scribes take extraordinary care not to waste any material. Every sheet must be used to its fullest. Mistakes are corrected rather than discarded. Nothing is thrown away that might still serve some purpose. The vellum before you has already been ruled. Yesterday evening, after the day's copying was complete, you spent an hour carefully measuring and marking this sheet, using a straight edge and a thin lid point to draw guidelines for your text. These lines are barely visible light enough that they will not show in the finished work, but dark enough that you can follow them precisely. Each line must be perfectly straight, perfectly parallel to the others. The spacing must be exact. The margins must be uniform. A page in a medieval manuscript is as much an act of geometric precision as it is of literary reproduction. Now, finally, you may begin writing. You dip your quill into the ink pot, touching the tip lightly to the rim to remove excess liquid. Too much ink, and it will blot on the vellum. Too little, and the letters will be pale and incomplete. You have learned through years of practice to judge the exact amount needed. Your hand hovers over the vellum for a moment. You take a breath. Then, with careful deliberation, you begin to form the first letter. The script flows from muscle memory, developed through endless repetition. Your hand moves in small, controlled gestures. Each letter is built from specific strokes, a downstroke here, a curved connector there, a hairline finishing stroke. The quill makes a soft scratching sound against the vellum surface, a sound that will fill your ears for hours. The work demands complete concentration. You must copy exactly what you see in the exemplar, letter for letter, without adding or omitting anything. This is not creative writing. You are not composing. You are reproducing, preserving, transmitting. A single error, a missed word, a transposed letter could corrupt the sacred text or render a legal document invalid. The responsibility weighs heavily. Your eyes move constantly between the exemplar and your work. You read a few words, memorize them, then transfer them to your page. Read, memorize, write. Read, memorize, write. The rhythm becomes meditative, almost trance-like. Your breathing slows. Your awareness narrows to the movement of the quill, the formation of letters, the slow progress across the page. The cold is a constant companion. Even though it is still morning, your fingers are beginning to stiffen. You pause occasionally to flex them, to restore circulation. Some scribes wear fingerless gloves, leaving only the thumb and first two fingers exposed. Others wrap their hands in cloth between periods of writing. In the coldest months, when frost forms on the inside of the windows, some monks resort to writing with their hands tucked inside their sleeves, exposing only the quill tip. The scriptorium has no fireplace. Fire is too dangerous in a room filled with parchment and precious manuscripts. A single spark could destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge. Instead, on the coldest days, a brazier of hot coals might be placed in the center of the room, far from any desks, offering minimal warmth. But mostly, you simply endure the cold. It becomes part of the work, another element of the discipline. Around you, your fellow scribes work in silence. You can hear the scratching of their quills, like a colony of insects moving through dry leaves. Occasionally, someone clears their throat or shifts position on their stool. Once in a while, a brother pauses to resharpen his quill, the knife blade rasping against horn. The light changes as the morning progresses. The sun climbs higher, and its rays begin to angle through the windows, moving slowly across the room. You watch this progression without fully thinking about it. Light is crucial to a scribe's work. On cloudy days, when the scriptorium remains dim, candles must be lit, but candlelight is expensive and less reliable than natural light. A scribe learns to work with whatever illumination is available, adjusting posture and angle to catch every available ray. You work steadily through the morning. The prayers at prime interrupted your labor briefly, and later terce will call you back to the chapel. But between these observances, you maintain your focus. Line by line, the text takes shape. Your hand moves across the vellum from left to right, and returns to begin the next line. The letters are uniform in size and spacing, each one carefully formed according to the strict rules of your script. There is a peculiar satisfaction in this work, despite its difficulty. When you complete a line without error, when the letters align perfectly with your guidelines, when the spacing is exactly right, there is a quiet pleasure in this precision. It is not the thrill of adventure or the joy of creation, but rather the deep contentment that comes from doing skilled work well, from exercising mastery over a difficult craft, from knowing that what you create will endure. But errors do occur. No scribe, no matter how experienced, works without mistakes. Perhaps halfway through a line, you realize you have skipped a word in the exemplar. Your heart sinks slightly, but you remain calm. There are procedures for this. If you have not yet written beyond the error, you might scrape away the incorrect text with your knife, carefully removing the ink without damaging the vellum beneath. The surface can then be re-smoothed with a pumice stone, and the correct text written in its place. If the error is discovered later, after more text has been written, you might add the missing word in the margin or between the lines, using a small mark to indicate where it should be inserted. Readers will understand these corrections. They are common in manuscripts. Perfection is an ideal pursued but rarely achieved. The physical demands of the work become apparent as the morning wears on. Your back begins to ache from maintaining a rigid posture. Your shoulders grow tense. Your eyes burn from the constant close focus. Your writing hand develops a familiar cramp in the muscles between thumb and forefinger. You pause to stretch, to rub the cramped muscles, to blink away the strain in your eyes. Some scribes work themselves to exhaustion in this trade. There are colophon's notes written at the end of manuscripts that speak poignantly of the scribe's suffering. Writing bows one's back. One medieval scribe wrote, "Thrusts the ribs into one's stomach and fosters a general debility of the body." Another complained that he who does not know how to write supposes it to be no labor. But though only 3 fingers write, the whole body labors. These complaints are not exaggerations. You feel their truth in your own body. Yet you return to the work, as you do every day, as you will continue to do. This is your contribution to the monastery, your service to God, your purpose. The bell for terce rings, its sound penetrating the scriptorium's concentration. You set down your quill carefully, cork the ink pot, and mark your place in the exemplar with a thin strip of leather. The morning's work is not yet complete, but the divine office calls. You rise stiffly from your stool, joints protesting, and file out with your fellow scribes toward the chapel. The service is brief. When you return, you resume exactly where you left off. This pattern will repeat throughout the day, work interrupted by prayer, prayer followed by more work. The structure is comforting in its predictability. You know what each hour will bring. After terce, you work until the midday meal, then more work until none, the afternoon prayer. Each segment of the day yields a few more lines of text, another fraction of a page completed. By the time Vespers calls you to evening prayer, you might have finished a full page, perhaps 2 if the work went smoothly and the light remained good. But there is more to a scribe's work than simply copying text. Some manuscripts require illumination-decorated initial letters, marginal illustrations, elaborate borders. This is specialized work, often done by scribes who have received additional training in painting and gilding. Perhaps you are one of these illuminators, or perhaps you work alongside them, leaving spaces in your text where they will later add their decorations. If you do illumination work, your afternoons might be spent grinding pigments. The colors used in medieval manuscripts come from expensive, exotic sources. Red from cinnabar or red lead. Blue from lapis lazuli, imported at great cost from Afghanistan. Gold from hammered gold leaf. Green from verdigris, made by exposing copper to vinegar fumes. Yellow from saffron or orpiment. These pigments must be ground to a fine powder using a mortar and pestle, a task that is both tedious and precise. The powder must be completely smooth, without any grains that might scratch the vellum or create uneven color. The grinding produces a rhythmic sound, the slow, circular scrape of stone on stone that joins the scriptorium's quiet symphony of working sounds. Once ground, the pigments are mixed with a binding medium, usually gum arabic or egg white, to create paint. The consistency must be perfect, fluid enough to flow from a fine brush, but thick enough to produce rich, opaque color. Too thin, and the colors are weak and transparent. Too thick, and they become difficult to apply smoothly. The application of gold leaf is particularly delicate. First, a base layer called gesso must be prepared from gypsum, white lead, and fish glue. This mixture is applied to the areas that will receive gilding and allowed to dry to a slightly sticky surface. Then the gold leaf, impossibly thin and fragile, is carefully laid onto the gesso and burnished with a smooth stone or a dog's tooth until it gleams. The process requires a steady hand and perfect timing. If the gesso is too dry, the gold will not adhere. If it is too wet, the gold will sink into it and lose its brilliance. But perhaps you are not an illuminator. Perhaps your work is purely textual, focused on accurate reproduction rather than decoration. In this case, your afternoons mirror your mornings, more hours bent over vellum, more lines of careful script, more concentration stretched until your mind feels as tired as your body. As the afternoon light begins to fade, the work becomes more difficult. the shadows lengthen. Your candle is lit, but its flickering light is less reliable than daylight. You can feel fatigue settling into your bones, the accumulated weariness of hours of intense focus. Yet you continue because there is always more to be done. Always another page, another manuscript, another commission waiting. Evening falls. The bell for Vespers releases you from your labor. You clean your workspace carefully, wiping excess ink from your quill, corking all the pots, covering your work to protect it from dust and moisture overnight. Tomorrow, you will return to this same desk, to this same manuscript, to this same patient labor. After Vespers comes supper, then a brief period of recreation in the cloister or common room, then Compline, the final prayer of the day, then sleep in your cold cell until the bell for matins wakes you once more and the cycle begins again. This is the rhythm of a scribe's life, day after day, week after week, year after year. Some scribes spend 40 or 50 years at this work, producing dozens of manuscripts, copying hundreds of thousands of words. Their identities are rarely known. Most manuscripts bear no signature, no indication of who labored to create them. They worked in anonymity, serving a purpose larger than themselves. Yet sometimes in the margins, or at the end of a manuscript, a scribe would add a brief note, a colophon, expressing their relief at finishing, a prayer for the reader, or occasionally a small complaint about the difficulty of the work. "Thank God it will soon be dark," wrote one tired scribe. Another penned, "The parchment is hairy, the ink is thin, the night is dark." These small human moments, preserved across centuries, remind us that these were real people with real struggles, not just faceless copiers of texts. Consider the loneliness of this work. Hour after hour in silence, your only companions the scratch of quills and the presence of fellow workers with whom you cannot speak. Consider the cold that numbs your fingers, the eye strain that builds throughout each day, the backache that becomes chronic after years of maintaining the same posture. Consider the responsibility, knowing that an error in copying scripture might spread false teachings, that a mistake in a legal document might cause injustice, that carelessness might corrupt knowledge passed down from antiquity. Yet consider, too, the moments of beauty, the satisfaction when a difficult passage is copied without error, the pleasure of preparing a perfect sheet of vellum, the quiet pride in completing a manuscript that will be treasured by its owner and read by generations unknown, the sense of participating in something timeless, the preservation and transmission of human knowledge and divine wisdom. The scriptorium is a world unto itself, separate from the busy life of the monastery's other departments. While the cellarer manages supplies and the almoner distributes charity, while the kitcheners prepare meals and the sacristans care for the chapel, you inhabit this quiet realm of ink and parchment, of silence and concentration, of patience and precision. In this space, time moves differently. Hours can pass in what feels like moments when you are deeply absorbed in the work. Or a single minute might stretch endlessly when your hand is cramping and your back is aching and you are struggling with a particularly difficult passage in the exemplar. The seasons mark themselves not by weather, for you spend most of your time indoors, regardless of season, but by the quality of light and the intensity of cold. Summer brings long hours of work, taking advantage of extended daylight. Winter brings shorter working days, compensated by candlelight, but never quite as productive. Spring and autumn are the golden seasons, with moderate temperatures and reliable light. Through all seasons, the work continues. Manuscripts must be produced, liturgical books for the monastery's own use, Bibles and psalters for sister institutions, books of hours for wealthy patrons, chronicles recording the monastery's history, charters documenting property rights. All of this requires scribes, patient workers willing to devote their lives to the laborious reproduction of the written word. Some manuscripts take months to complete. A large Bible might occupy a team of scribes for a year or more. The work is divided among several hands. One scribe copying the Pentateuch, another the historical books, a third the prophets, and so on. Occasionally, you can see these different hands in a finished manuscript, subtle variations in letter formation or spacing that reveal the individual human beings behind the work. But whether working alone or as part of a team, the experience is fundamentally the same. The slow accumulation of words, the patient formation of letters, the maintenance of focus despite discomfort and fatigue, the acceptance that this is your life's work, valuable not for any glory it brings, for it brings none, but for the service it provides, the knowledge it preserves, the tradition it continues. As you lie in your bed at night, in the darkness before sleep comes, you might flex your stiff fingers, feel the ache in your writing hand, blink your tired eyes. Your back protests the day's posture. Your neck is tense. But there is also a deep, quiet satisfaction. You have spent your day in meaningful labor. You have contributed something to the world, even if your name will never be known, even if your particular page among thousands will never be remarked upon. Tomorrow, you will rise to the bell for matins. Tomorrow, you will return to the scriptorium. Tomorrow, you will dip your quill in ink and begin again, continuing the slow, patient work that defines your existence. And the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as your eyes remain sharp enough to read, your hand steady enough to write, your mind focused enough to copy without error. This is the life of a medieval scribe, not dramatic, not adventurous, not filled with variety or excitement, but purposeful, disciplined, devoted to a craft that requires complete dedication. A life measured in pages produced, in words copied, in manuscripts completed, and sent out into the world to fulfill whatever purpose they were created for. And in the silence of the scriptorium, in the scratch of quill on vellum, in the slow accumulation of text on page after page, there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of emptiness, but the peace of focused labor, of knowing one's place and purpose, of doing work that matters, even if the worker remains unknown. Let us now turn our attention from the general to the particular, from the daily routines of anonymous scribes to one specific man and his extraordinary labor. His name was Edfrith, and in the early years of the 8th century, on a wind-swept island off the coast of Northumbria, he embarked upon a project that would consume years of his life and produce one of the most magnificent manuscripts ever created in medieval Europe. The island of Lindisfarne lies in the cold waters of the North Sea, connected to the mainland only at low tide by a causeway that disappears twice daily beneath the waves. It is a place of isolation, of harsh weather, of salt wind and gray skies. Here, in the year 635, Irish monks had established a monastery that would become one of the great centers of learning and spirituality in Anglo-Saxon England. Edfrith came to this monastery as a young man, perhaps in his teens, entering the religious life as so many did in that era. We know little of his early years' medieval records, rarely concerned themselves with the childhoods of monks. But we can imagine his training, the slow accumulation of skills that would eventually make him capable of the work he would undertake. He learned to read and write, first in his native Old English, then in Latin. He learned the scripts, the uncial and half-uncial letter forms that characterized insular manuscripts. He learned to prepare vellum, to mix inks and pigments, to hold a quill with the proper angle and pressure. He copied texts, as all novice scribes did. Simple prayers at first, then longer passages, then complete books. His hand grew steady. His letters became uniform. His eye learned to judge spacing and alignment. Year by year, his skill developed until he was recognized as one of the monastery's master scribes. But Edfrith was more than a scribe. He was also an artist, trained in the complex geometric patterns and elaborate animal motifs that characterized insular art, that distinctive fusion of Celtic, Germanic, and Mediterranean influences that flourished in the monasteries of Ireland and northern Britain. He could draw the intricate interlaced patterns, the spirals within spirals, the fantastic beasts that seemed to twist and flow across the page. In 698, Edfrith was elevated to the position of Bishop of Lindisfarne, a recognition of his learning, his piety, and his administrative abilities. He was now responsible for the spiritual welfare of the monastery and its surrounding community, for maintaining relationships with other religious houses and secular authorities, for the countless duties that came with ecclesiastical leadership. Yet sometime around the year 715, having held his bishopric for nearly 2 decades, Edfrith began a project unlike any he had attempted before. He would create a gospel book, complete manuscript of the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he would create it entirely by himself, serving as both scribe and illuminator. This was unusual. Most major manuscripts were collaborative efforts, with different hands responsible for different aspects of the work. But Edfrith would do it all alone. His motivation, according to later tradition, was devotional. The manuscript would honor St. Cuthbert, a former bishop of Lindisfarne, who had died in 687, and whose cult was growing throughout northern England. Cuthbert had been a man of great holiness, known for his asceticism, his miracles, and his deep connection to the natural world of the island. Creating a gospel book in his honor was both an act of piety and a contribution to the monastery's prestige. Imagine Edfrith as he begins this work. He is middle-aged by medieval standards, perhaps in his 40s. He has responsibilities that cannot be neglected: services to conduct, visitors to receive, decisions to make. Yet he carves out time for this project, hours claimed from sleep or recreation, spaces found between his official duties. Some scholars believe he may have worked on the manuscript in deliberate isolation, perhaps withdrawing periodically to live as a hermit in the tradition of the Irish monks who had founded Lindisfarne, using the labor of manuscript creation as a form of prayer and meditation. The first task is planning. A gospel book of the ambition Edfrith envisions will require careful organization. He must determine the layout, how many lines per page, how wide the margins, where to place the elaborate decorative elements he has planned. He must calculate how much vellum will be needed. The final manuscript will contain 259 leaves, 518 pages, each approximately 13 inches tall and 9 inches wide. This will require the skins of perhaps 150 calves, an enormous expense that speaks to the monastery's commitment to the project. The vellum must be prepared with extraordinary care, for this manuscript will be a treasure, not a simple working copy. Each skin must be scraped smooth, stretched evenly, treated with lime, and polished until the surface is perfect for both writing and painting. A quality of the vellum in the Lindisfarne Gospels, still visible after 13 centuries, testifies to the care taken in this preparation. Then Edfrith begins to write. He uses a script called insular majuscule, a formal book hand characterized by broad, rounded letters. Each letter must be formed with complete consistency. Over the course of the manuscript, he will write tens of thousands of words, hundreds of thousands of individual letters. The text is Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation of the Gospels, which Edfrith knows intimately from years of reading and study. But this is not merely a text. Edfrith has planned something far more elaborate. Each Gospel will open with a portrait of its author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, shown seated with their writing materials, accompanied by their symbolic creatures, the angel, the lion, the ox, and the eagle. These portraits are full-page illuminations, complex compositions that require careful planning and execution. Before each gospel text begins, there will be a carpet page, a full page of pure ornament, dominated by a large cross set within an intricate background of geometric and zoomorphic patterns. The term carpet page comes from their resemblance to Oriental carpets, with their dense, all-over decoration and rich colors. Creating these pages is an immense labor, requiring thousands of tiny, precise pen strokes to build up the interlocking patterns. The opening words of each gospel, Liber Generationis for Matthew, In idiom Evangelii, for Mark, are given elaborate decorated initials that sprawl across the page, their forms filled with yet more intricate patterns. Every element must be planned in advance, sketched lightly and lead point before the final ink and paint are applied. Edfrith works slowly, methodically. This is not a project that can be rushed. A single carpet page might take weeks to complete. The portrait of an evangelist requires careful attention to proportion, to the fall of drapery, to the positioning of hands, and the rendering of faces. The decorated initials demand absolute precision in the execution of their knotwork and spirals. Imagine him in his workspace, perhaps a cell within the monastery, perhaps a separate building where he can work undisturbed. The light comes from a window facing south, supplemented on dark days by candles or oil lamps. His tools are laid out before him. Quills of various sizes for different purposes, pots of ink, small containers of prepared pigments, brushes made from animal hair, a pumice stone for smoothing corrections, a knife for scraping away errors. The colors he uses are extraordinary. The blues come from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported from Afghanistan at enormous expense, ground to powder and mixed with binding medium. The reds are lead-based pigments, the yellows from orpiment, the purples from folium, a dye extracted from certain plants. He mixes these colors himself, grinding the pigments carefully to ensure they are perfectly smooth. Days pass into weeks. Weeks pass into months. The seasons turn. Winter on Lindisfarne is brutal wind howls across the island. Rain lashes the monastery buildings, and on the coldest days, ice forms in the water buckets. Spring brings some relief, but also fog that rolls in from the sea, creating days of dim, gray light. Summer offers the longest working hours, when daylight stretches late into the evening. Autumn brings storms again, the first hints of the returning cold. Through all seasons, Edfrith continues his work. His hands cramp from the precise movements required for the intricate patterns. His eyes strain from the close focus. His back aches from the hours of maintaining a rigid posture. But the manuscript grows, page by page, gathering substance and beauty. Consider the carpet pages, those extraordinary displays of geometric and zoomorphic ornament. The cross at the center of each page is surrounded by patterns of such complexity that the eye can barely follow them. Spirals rotate in perfect circles. Ribbons of color weave over and under each other in intricate interlace. Animal forms, birds, dogs, serpents twist through the design, their bodies elongated and stylized, curving back on themselves in impossible contortions. Creating these patterns requires not only artistic skill, but mathematical precision. The designs are based on careful geometric constructions, circles, triangles, squares, that provide the underlying structure. But within this geometric framework, Edfrith achieves something alive and dynamic, a sense of movement and energy that seems to pulse across the page. The evangelist portraits are equally remarkable. Though the figures are rendered in the stylized manner of insular art, rather than naturalistic representation, they convey a sense of dignity and contemplation. Each evangelist sits absorbed in his task of writing the gospel, surrounded by symbols of divine inspiration. The colors in these portraits are rich and varied robes of purple and red, backgrounds of gold and blue, careful shading that gives depth to the compositions. Years pass. Edfrith continues to fulfill his duties as bishop while devoting every spare moment to the manuscript. He conducts services, receives visitors, manages the monastery's affairs. But always, he returns to his manuscript, to the steady accumulation of text and ornament that is gradually filling the prepared vellum sheets. There are difficulties, as there always are in such work. Sometimes a pigment does not behave as expected, remaining grainy despite grinding. Sometimes the vellum has an imperfection, a thin spot or a hair follicle that disrupts the writing surface. Sometimes his hand simply makes an error, and he must scrape away the mistake and begin again. But these setbacks are accepted as part of the process. obstacles to be overcome through patience and care. The concentration required for this work is extraordinary. When creating the carpet pages or the decorated initials, Edfrith must maintain absolute focus for hours at a time. A single slip of the pen could ruin a pattern that took days to create. The thin lines that form the interlace must be perfectly uniform. The spirals must be precisely circular. The color fills must be completely even without gaps or overlaps. Some scholars believe the entire project took Edfrith between 5 and 7 years to complete, working perhaps a few hours each day when his other duties allowed. Imagine the mental discipline required to maintain this level of quality over such an extended period. Every day, returning to the work. Every day, maintaining the same standard of excellence. Never allowing fatigue or impatience to compromise the result. Around the year 720, give or take a year or two, the manuscript is complete. 259 leaves of vellum, filled with the complete text of the 4 Gospels, adorned with 16 pages of ornamental canon tables, 5 fully decorated carpet pages, 4 evangelist portraits, and elaborate decorated initials introducing each Gospel and major section. Edfrith has created, entirely by himself, one of the supreme achievements of medieval manuscript art, the Lindisfarne Gospels. 4. That is how the manuscript will be known to history stands, as a testament to what one skilled person can accomplish through years of dedicated labor, working patiently and methodically toward a distant goal. Yet Edfrith himself will not live long to see his work appreciated. He dies in 721, just a year or so after completing the manuscript. Whether he succumbed to illness, to the accumulated strain of his labors, or simply to age, we do not know. Medieval records note the facts of his death, but provide no details of his final days. The manuscript, however, endures. It is bound in a magnificent cover-later tradition, credits a man named Bilfrith with creating a jeweled binding, though this original binding has been lost. The Gospels are used in the monastery's liturgical life, displayed on feast days, perhaps carried in processions. They become one of Lindisfarne's treasures, a source of pride and a focus of devotion. In the 10th century, when Viking raids threaten Lindisfarne, the monks flee the island, carrying the manuscript with them along with the relics of St. Cuthbert. The Gospel book survives this displacement, as it will survive centuries of political upheaval, religious reformation, and changing tastes. Today, it resides in the British Library in London, where it is recognized as one of the masterpieces of medieval art. But in focusing on the manuscript's fame and survival, we should not lose sight of the essential nature of Edfrith's accomplishment. This was not rapid inspiration, but sustained effort. Not a burst of creative energy, but years of patient labor. Not work done for recognition for in his lifetime. Few beyond Lindisfarne would have seen the manuscript, but work done as an offering, a devotion, a personal discipline. Consider what Edfrith sacrificed for this project. The hours that might have been spent in rest or prayer or the company of his fellow monks. The strain on his eyes and hands and back. The isolation required for such concentrated work. The risk that illness or death might prevent him from completing what he had begun. Yet he persevered, driven by a combination of artistic vision, religious devotion, and simple determination to finish what he had started. In a sense, Edfrith's story is the story of every scribe magnified and intensified. The same skills, the same patience, the same attention to detail, but sustained at the highest level of ambition over an extraordinary length of time. Most scribes produced many manuscripts over the course of their careers. Edfrith poured years of his life into a single manuscript, seeking not quantity, but a particular kind of perfection. When you hold a book today, think of Edfrith. Think of the months he spent mixing pigments, grinding lapis lazuli into powder for that particular shade of blue. Think of the weeks he devoted to a single carpet page, building up its pattern stroke by tiny stroke. Think of the concentration required to copy the gospel texts without error, maintaining perfect letter formation across hundreds of pages. Think of the cold of the Lindisfarne winters, and the strain of working in dim light, and the aches that must have accompanied him to bed each night. His life exemplifies the monastic ideal: work as prayer, craft as devotion, patience as virtue. In the silence of his workspace, in the slow movement of his pen across vellum, in the gradual accumulation of text and ornament, Edfith practiced a form of meditation, a sustained focus that was itself a spiritual discipline. The manuscript he created is beautiful, certainly, but perhaps its deepest significance lies not in its aesthetic achievement, but in what it represents: the capacity of human beings to devote themselves completely to a task, to maintain discipline and focus over years, to create something lasting through the accumulation of countless small, careful actions. This is a lesson that the scriptorium teaches again and again. Great works are not produced in moments of inspiration, but through sustained effort over time. The manuscript that seems to appear as a complete, perfect object is actually the result of days and months and years of labor, of thousands of individual decisions and actions, of persistent attention to detail and quality. And when the work is finally complete, when the last letter is written and the last illumination painted, when the pages are gathered and bound and the cover is attached, what then? For Edfrith, there was perhaps a moment of satisfaction, of completion, of knowing that he had accomplished what he set out to do. And then, having created his masterpiece, he returned to his other duties, to the daily round of prayer and administration that filled a bishop's life. The manuscript went on without him, began its long journey through history, while Edfrith himself faded into the obscurity that claimed most medieval figures. For centuries, even his name was uncertain, preserved only in a colophon added hundreds of years after his death. The work survived. The worker was nearly forgotten. Yet in that forgetting, there is something characteristic of the medieval attitude toward craft and creation. The work mattered more than the worker. The manuscript was created for the glory of God and the honor of St. Cuthbert, not for Edfrith's personal fame. If his name was lost, if future generations did not know who had labored over those pages, it would not diminish the value of what he had created. This is the mindset of the scriptorium work, done not for recognition, but for its own sake, for the purpose it serves, for the satisfaction of doing it well. And in this mindset, there is a kind of freedom. Freedom from the need for applause or appreciation. Freedom to work in solitude and silence. Freedom to devote oneself completely to the task at hand, knowing that the task itself is sufficient justification for the labor it requires. So as we imagine Edfrith at his desk, year after year, page after page, we might find something restful in his dedication, something calming in his patience, something peaceful in his willingness to let the work unfold at its own pace, without hurry, without shortcuts, without compromise. The Lindisfarne Gospels took as long as they took. The patterns were as intricate as they needed to be. The colors were as rich as Edfrith could make them. And when the work was done, it was done completely, done well, done to a standard that still impresses viewers 13 centuries later. This is what one person can accomplish, given time and skill and dedication. This is what the quiet, patient labor of the scriptorium could produce, not quickly, not easily, but enduringly. We have explored the daily life of scribes and the extraordinary achievement of one particular craftsman. Now let us consider a more mysterious dimension of the manuscript world, the phenomenon of texts that lie hidden beneath other texts, waiting centuries to be discovered. This is the realm of the palimpsest, where medieval economy and modern technology intersect to reveal secrets long thought lost. The word palimpsest comes from Greek, meaning scraped again. It refers to a manuscript page from which the original text has been removed, so that the parchment might be reused for new writing. To understand why this practice existed, we must first remember the extraordinary value of writing materials in the medieval world. Parchment was expensive. The preparation of animal skins into smooth, durable writing surfaces required time, skill, and resources. A single large manuscript might require the skins of hundreds of animals. For smaller monasteries, for religious communities in remote locations, for scriptoriums operating with limited funds, obtaining sufficient parchment for all their copying needs was a constant challenge. And so, when a manuscript became damaged, or its text was deemed obsolete or less important than other works that needed to be copied, the practical solution was to recycle the parchment. The existing text would be scraped away with a knife or washed with various solutions milk, citrus juice, or other substances that could help lift the ink. The parchment would then be dried, smoothed with pumice, and made ready to receive new text. Imagine a monk in a scriptorium, perhaps in the 12th or 13th century, given the task of preparing parchment for reuse. Before him lies a manuscript from centuries earlier, perhaps a Greek text copied in the 6th century, now considered less essential than the Latin liturgical work that needs to be produced. He takes up his knife, a broad-bladed tool designed for scraping, and begins the laborious process of removing the old text. The scraping must be thorough, but not so aggressive that it damages the parchment itself. Too much pressure, and the parchment might tear or develop holes. Too little, and the old text will remain visible, potentially confusing future readers. He works methodically, stroke by stroke, watching as the ancient letters disappear under his blade, becoming pale ghosts, then fading to near invisibility. But here is the crucial fact that medieval scribes did not understand. Ink penetrates parchment. Even when the surface text has been scraped away, traces of the original writing remain embedded in the fibers of the skin. These traces are often invisible to the naked eye, or appear only as the faintest shadows, easily overlooked or mistaken for stains or imperfections in the parchment. For centuries, these hidden texts remained inaccessible. A palimpsest appeared to contain only its later, visible text. The earlier writing was lost, erased by the practical needs of medieval scriptoriums. Scholars might notice that a manuscript was written on reused parchment, but reading the undertext, the earlier, scraped-away writing, was nearly impossible. Consider the Archimedes palimpsest, one of the most remarkable examples of this phenomenon. In the 10th century, an anonymous scribe in Constantinople copied several treatises by Archimedes, the great mathematician of ancient Greece, onto parchment. The text was written in Greek, in careful Byzantine minuscule script. For perhaps 3 centuries, this manuscript preserved some of Archimedes' most important works, including his explorations of geometry, his calculations of areas and volumes, his investigations into the nature of infinity. Then, in the 13th century, a monk needed parchment for a prayer book. Archimedes' mathematical treatises, written in Greek, were perhaps difficult to read in a monastery, where Latin had become the primary scholarly language. Or perhaps the monasteries simply had more urgent need of prayer books than mathematical texts. Whatever the reason, the decision was made to reuse the parchment. The scribe unbound the Archimedes manuscript and separated its pages. He scraped away the mathematical text until only faint traces remained. Then, to create pages of a different size and orientation, he cut each sheet in half and rotated the pieces 90 degrees. When he wrote his prayers, the lines of his text ran perpendicular to the faint shadows of Archimedes' work beneath. The mathematical treatises disappeared, hidden under layers of liturgical prayer. The prayer book survived the centuries. It passed through various hands, resided in different libraries, endured wars and upheavals. In the early 20th century, someone painted religious images on several of its pages, perhaps hoping to increase its value. These forgeries added yet another layer, obscuring the original Archimedes text first scraped away, then written over, now covered with paint. In 1998, this manuscript came to auction and was purchased by an anonymous collector who entrusted it to the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore for conservation and study. By this time, scholars had recognized that the manuscript was a palimpsest containing Archimedes' work, but much of the text remained unreadable. The scraping had been too thorough, the overwriting too dense, the forgeries too opaque. Modern imaging technology offered hope. Using ultraviolet and infrared light, researchers could see traces of the Archimedes text that were invisible under normal light. Different wavelengths of light interact differently with ancient inks and parchment, revealing variations in the material that the human eye cannot detect. This multispectral imaging recovered much of the hidden text, bringing Archimedes' mathematical reasoning back into visibility after 7 centuries of obscurity. But some pages remained stubbornly illegible, particularly those covered by the forged paintings. Here, scientists turned to an even more sophisticated technique: X-ray fluorescence imaging at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. The intense X-ray beam could pass through the paint and the prayer text, detecting the iron in the ancient ink that Archimedes' Scribe had used 1,000 years before. Imagine the moment when previously unreadable text begins to appear on computer screens, letter by letter, as the X-ray beam scans across the parchment. Ancient Greek characters, unseen for centuries, emerge from the layered history of the manuscript. Mathematical diagrams take shape. Archimedes' voice speaks again across the gulf of time, discussing problems of geometry and infinity. The Archimedes palimpsest is exceptional in its significance, but it is not unique in its nature. Palimpsests exist in libraries and collections throughout the world. At St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, researchers have identified thousands of palimpsest pages among the monastery's ancient manuscript collection. This monastery, situated at the foot of Mount Sinai, has preserved manuscripts for over 1,500 years. Its dry desert climate and relative isolation have protected books that might have been lost elsewhere. Among these manuscripts are numerous palimpsest texts that were scraped and reused, sometimes multiple times, creating complex layering of different periods and languages. The Sinai Palimpsest Project has used multispectral imaging to photograph nearly 7,000 pages, revealing hidden texts in Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and other languages. The undertexts include biblical passages from the 5th and 6th centuries, medical treatises discussing treatments for ailments like scorpion stings, works by Hippocrates, lists of medical terms, and various other texts that provide insight into what books were available to monks in the early medieval period. Some of these hidden texts are secular works, medical writings, scientific treatises that monasteries consulted for practical purposes, even as their primary focus remained religious. The presence of such texts in palimpsests suggests that monasteries had more diverse libraries than might be assumed, and that practical knowledge was valued alongside spiritual texts. More recently, students at the Rochester Institute of Technology discovered hidden 15th century text on medieval manuscript leaves using an imaging system they had developed. These students, working as part of their studies, found text that had been invisible to the naked eye, demonstrating that palimpsests continue to be discovered and that new technologies make previously impossible readings now achievable. Consider what this means. Scattered throughout the world's libraries and collections are manuscripts that contain more than they appear to contain. Beneath visible texts lie earlier writings, scraped away centuries ago, but not completely erased. Some of these hidden texts have survived nowhere else. They represent unique witnesses to works that would otherwise be completely lost. The practice of creating palimpsests was most common during certain periods of manuscript history. In the early medieval period, particularly from the 7th through 9th centuries, when parchment was especially scarce and expensive, many older manuscripts were recycled. Greek texts were often palimpsested in Latin-speaking regions, where they could no longer be easily read. Classical works, the writings of ancient poets, historians, and philosophers, were sometimes deemed less important than Christian texts, and were scraped away to make room for Bibles or theological treatises. In a sense, the palimpsest represents a kind of cultural archaeology. The visible text shows what a particular community valued and needed at the time a palimpsest was created. The hidden text reveals what had been available earlier, what was considered less essential, what could be sacrificed for immediate needs. The layers tell a story of changing priorities, shifting languages, and the practical economics of manuscript culture. But there is also something melancholy in contemplating palimpsests. Each one represents a decision to destroy, or at least to obscure an existing text. The monk scraping away Archimedes' mathematics to write prayers was simply doing what was practical and necessary. He could not have known that he was erasing one of the only surviving copies of works that would be desperately sought by scholars centuries later. He saw old parchment that could be reused, not an irreplaceable record of ancient science. We cannot blame these medieval scribes for their practical decisions. They worked within the constraints of their world, where parchment was a limited resource and copying texts was an enormous labor. If they had not reused parchment, many manuscripts that do survive, including the prayer books written over earlier texts, would never have been created at all. Yet we can feel a sense of loss for what was erased, even as we appreciate the ingenuity of modern technology in recovering some of what was hidden. Each palimpsest is simultaneously a survival and a loss, a preservation and an erasure, a practical solution and a historical tragedy. The process of examining palimpsests requires extraordinary patience. Researchers must photograph each page under multiple wavelengths of visible light, ultraviolet, infrared, and sometimes X-rays. Each imaging session produces multiple images that must be carefully processed and analyzed. The visible text must be digitally separated from the undertext. Letters that are faint or ambiguous must be compared with other examples to determine what they might be. It is detective work, puzzle solving, a slow process of reconstruction and interpretation. Some undertexts remain stubbornly illegible despite the best imaging technology. Others reveal themselves gradually, requiring multiple attempts with different techniques before the hidden letters become clear enough to read. And sometimes, the hidden text proves to be something unexpected. Researchers seeking one thing discover another. A palimpsested biblical text might reveal itself to be a variant version with previously unknown readings. A recycled liturgical manuscript might hide a fragment of classical literature thought to be completely lost. The palimpsest becomes a source of surprise, of discovery, of connection to voices that had fallen silent. There is something meditative in imagining this process, the patient photographing, the careful analysis, the gradual emergence of hidden text. It mirrors, in a way, the patient labor of the scribes themselves. Just as scribes worked slowly and methodically to create manuscripts, so modern researchers work slowly and methodically to reveal what lies hidden within them. Consider a researcher sitting before a computer screen, examining multispectral images of a palimpsest page. The screen shows multiple overlapping texts, a clear later writing, the faint shadows of the earlier text beneath, the stains and imperfections of parchment that has survived for centuries. The researcher zooms in, compares different wavelength images, tries to distinguish between actual letters and marks that merely resemble letters. Hour by hour, day by day, the hidden text is slowly deciphered. One letter becomes clear, then another. Words form. Sentences emerge. Meaning begins to take shape from what had been only shadows and confusion. The work requires not only technical skill, but also linguistic knowledge, paleographic expertise, and simple patience, the willingness to sit with uncertainty, to work gradually toward understanding, to accept that some mysteries may remain unsolved. The palimpsest teaches us that texts have histories that extend beyond their visible contents. A manuscript is not simply what we see on its surface, but also the accumulated layers of its past. The earlier writings it might contain, the hands that have held it, the decisions that shaped it, the accidents that preserved or damaged it. In this sense, every manuscript is somewhat like a palimpsest, even those that were never literally scraped and reused. Every manuscript carries traces of the people and processes that created it. The choice of text, the quality of parchment, the style of script, the presence or absence of decoration, all these elements tell stories about the manuscript's origins and purposes. Modern scholarship has developed sophisticated tools for reading these stories. Biocarticological analysis can identify the species of animal whose skin was used for parchment, revealing information about regional practices and trade networks. Chemical analysis of inks can date manuscripts and identify forgeries. Digital imaging can reveal corrections, erasures, and pentimenti changes of mind by scribes or artists. The manuscript becomes a rich source of information that extends far beyond the words it was intended to convey. It is an artifact, a historical document, a witness to the material culture and intellectual life of the medieval world. But beneath all this scholarly analysis remains the fundamental human element. Someone wrote the hidden text that lies beneath a palimpsest. Someone made the decision to erase it. Someone else wrote the text that covers it. And now, someone works to recover what was hidden. Across centuries, human decisions and actions connect, creating a chain of preservation and loss, concealment and revelation. The scriptorium produced not only manuscripts, but also, inadvertently, mysteries texts hidden within texts, voices silenced, then gradually recovered, knowledge that seemed lost, but was actually only sleeping, waiting for the right technology to reawaken it. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those hidden texts lying in libraries and collections around the world. Beneath visible words, faint traces of earlier writing persist, patient and silent. They have waited centuries already. They can wait longer until someone with the right tools and the right questions comes seeking what they have to say. The palimpsest reminds us that nothing is truly gone while any trace remains. The scraped parchment still holds the shadow of what was written on it. The overwritten page still whispers its earlier text to those who know how to listen. History is layered, complex, never completely erased, always ready to reveal new dimensions to patient inquiry. And in this persistence, this refusal to be completely obliterated, there is something hopeful. The labor of long-dead scribes, even when deliberately erased, survives in traces fine enough that modern instruments can detect and read them. The voices of ancient mathematicians, medieval physicians, and anonymous copyists speak again, teaching us what they knew, showing us how they thought, connecting us to the great chain of human learning and creativity that stretches back through the centuries. We have spent much of our time in the monastery scriptorium, in that quiet world of religious devotion and patient labor. But not all medieval scribes worked within monastic walls. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly from the 13th century onward, manuscript production increasingly moved into secular hands. Professional scribes who worked for profit, court artisans who served royal patrons, and commercial workshops that produced books as luxury commodities for wealthy clients. The world of the secular scribe was different in fundamental ways from the monastic scriptorium. Where the monk worked in silence as an act of religious duty, the professional scribe worked in a commercial environment, negotiating prices, meeting deadlines, and managing the demands of clients who had very specific ideas about what they wanted. The rhythm of work was shaped not by the canonical hours of prayer, but by the economic pressures of running a business and satisfying patrons who expected value for their considerable investment. Consider the city of Paris in the 14th century. The university has created a demand for textbooks, copies of Aristotle, commentaries on scripture, legal texts for students of canon and civil law. Wealthy nobles and ecclesiastical officials desire prayer books, particularly books of hours, those private devotional volumes that were becoming fashionable among the elite. The market for manuscripts has grown beyond what monasteries alone can supply. In response, professional scriptoriums emerge. These are commercial enterprises, sometimes organized into guilds that regulate the trade and maintain standards. In some cities, scribes join the Guild of St. Luke, alongside painters and illuminators, their trades recognized as related crafts requiring similar skills. The guild provides structure rules about who may practice the trade, standards for materials and workmanship, mechanisms for resolving disputes between masters and clients. The professional scribe's workshop is not silent. Apprentices move about, preparing materials. The master scribe might dictate instructions or discuss a commission with a client. There is conversation, the sounds of ordinary commerce, a bustle that would be unthinkable in the monastic scriptorium. The work is still painstaking and precise, but the atmosphere is fundamentally different, practical rather than devotional, commercial rather than contemplative. Yet the basic skills remain the same. The professional scribe must still prepare parchment, mix inks, maintain sharp quills, and execute script with perfect consistency. If anything, the professional faces greater pressure to work quickly, for time is money in a way it never was in the monastery. A commission delayed might mean a client lost, income foregone, a reputation damaged. The professional scribe often specialized. One might focus on legal documents, charters, property deeds, court records work that required absolute accuracy and an understanding of proper formulae. Another might specialize in university texts, copying the same philosophical treatises again and again for student use. A third might concentrate on luxury volumes for wealthy patrons, where the quality of materials and the beauty of execution mattered more than speed of production. This last category, luxury manuscripts commissioned by the two wealthy, represents a different world entirely from the practical production we have discussed so far. These are manuscripts as art objects, as displays of wealth and taste, as symbols of status and cultivation. They are not simply texts to be read, but treasures to be possessed, admired, and displayed. Imagine yourself no longer as a monk in a cold scriptorium, but as a scribe employed by one of the great noble patrons of the late medieval period. Perhaps you work for Jean, Duke of Berry, brother to the King of France, and one of history's most extravagant collectors, and patrons of manuscript art. The Duke maintains a large household of artisans, painters, jewelers, goldsmiths, and scribes, all dedicated to creating and acquiring beautiful objects for his collection. Your working conditions are comfortable in ways a monastic scribe could never imagine. The Duke's workshop is heated. You have access to the finest materials without concern for cost. The parchment is of exceptional quality, perfectly smooth and white. Your pigments include genuine ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, gold leaf of the purest quality, exotic colors imported at great expense. When you need a particular shade or material, it is procured for you. But with these luxuries come different pressures. The Duke is exacting in his standards. He knows what he wants and expects it to be delivered with perfection. You are not working for the glory of God or the preservation of knowledge, though these may be secondary benefits. You are working to satisfy a patron whose taste is refined and whose patience is limited. The manuscript you are creating is not simply a book, but a demonstration of the Duke's wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. The text you are copying might be a book of hours, those elaborate prayer books that had become essential possessions for the wealthy. But this is no simple devotional aid. The Duke's Book of Hours will be a masterpiece of the illuminator's art, filled with elaborate miniatures depicting biblical scenes, saints, and even the Duke himself in prayer. The calendar pages will include illustrations of the labors appropriate to each month. Peasants sowing and harvesting, nobles hunting and feasting, all rendered with exquisite detail. You work as part of a team. Other scribes handle different portions of the text. Illuminators paint the miniatures. Specialists apply the gold leaf. An artist draws the elaborate borders that frame each page, filled with acanthus leaves, flowers, insects, and fantastical creatures. The work is coordinated by the Duke's secretary, who manages the project, ensures that everyone maintains the same standards, and reports progress to the Duke himself. The pace of work varies. Sometimes there is urgency. The Duke wants a particular manuscript completed for a special occasion, perhaps as a gift for a royal relative or to commemorate a significant event. At other times, a project unfolds over years, with work progressing steadily but without particular haste. The Duke collects books the way others collect jewels or relics, not from immediate need, but from insatiable desire to possess beautiful and rare objects. Your compensation is substantial compared to what a monastic scribe would receive. For monks, of course, receive no direct payment at all, only their maintenance within the monastery. You earn wages, and if your work pleases the duke, you might receive bonuses or gifts. You have the satisfaction of knowing that your work is valued in concrete material terms. But you also lack the security and community of monastic life. Your employment depends on the duke's pleasure and financial stability. Patrons die, fortunes change, political upheavals can end a comfortable position. The manuscripts you help create are extraordinary objects. The Tours Riches Heirs du Duc de Berry, perhaps the most famous book of hours ever created, exemplifies the heights this art could reach. Its calendar pages depict the Duke's castles in the background of seasonal scenes. The miniatures are painted with incredible delicacy and attention to detail. The colors remain vivid after 6 centuries. Looking at these pages, even in reproduction, one feels the presence of enormous wealth and refined taste. But consider what this luxury required: the labor of multiple skilled artisans working for years. Materials gathered from across the known world: lapis from Afghanistan, gold from Africa, parchment from specially raised calves. The concentration of resources that could have fed families or supported communities, instead directed toward creating beautiful objects for private enjoyment. The manuscript is ultimate luxury good, available only to those at the very pinnacle of society. The contrast with monastic production is striking. Where the monk worked in cold and discomfort, accepting hardship as part of his spiritual discipline, the court scribe worked in comfort, treated as a valued craftsman. Where the monk worked in silence and anonymity, the court scribe might be known by name, his reputation spreading among potential patrons. Where the monastery produced manuscripts primarily for its own use, or for sister institutions, the court workshop produced purely for the patron's pleasure and prestige. Yet both types of scribes shared fundamental aspects of their craft. Both required steady hands, sharp eyes, and endless patience. Both spent long hours bent over parchment, forming letters with careful precision. Both knew the ache of cramped fingers, the strain of sustained concentration, the satisfaction of completing a page without error. The work itself, at its core, remained the same: ink on parchment, letter by letter, word by word, page by page. There were also secular scribes of much humbler status than those employed by great lords. In manor courts and town halls, scribes kept records of legal proceedings, property transactions, tax assessments, and countless other administrative matters. These were working scribes, producing functional documents with little or no decoration, writing in vernacular languages rather than Latin, serving the everyday needs of governance and commerce. These scribes prepared their own parchment, smoothing it with pumice and lining it with stylus and all. They sat in cold offices, for manor courts were not heated any more lavishly than monastery scriptoriums. Their work required different skills than literary copying. They needed to know proper legal formulae, to understand the specific language required for different types of documents, to produce writing that was clear and official-looking. The pay was modest. The work was repetitive. There was little room for artistry or personal expression. Yet this work was essential to the functioning of medieval society. Without these humble scribes, property rights could not be recorded, court decisions could not be documented, tax records could not be maintained. They were the bureaucrats of the medieval world, enabling governance through their patient recording of routine transactions. By the late medieval period, perhaps by 1300, even monasteries were increasingly purchasing their manuscripts from commercial workshops rather than producing them themselves. The economics had shifted. Specialized professional scriptoriums could produce manuscripts more efficiently than monasteries whose primary purpose was prayer rather than book production. Monks might still copy some texts for their own use, but the great age of the monastic scriptorium was passing. This shift represents a broader transformation in medieval culture, the gradual commercialization of activities that had once been purely religious or communal. Books became commodities, traded in markets, produced to order for paying clients. The craft of the scribe, once primarily a monastic vocation, became a secular profession, regulated by guilds and governed by economic considerations. The professional scribe might be a man or a woman worked in manuscript production, particularly in family workshops, though guild regulations sometimes excluded them from becoming masters in their own right. A scribe's daughter who learned the trade from her father might spend her life copying manuscripts, but never achieve official recognition of her skills. Yet the work was done regardless of who received credit for it, and women's hands contributed to many of the manuscripts that survive. As you contemplate these different worlds of scribal labor, the silent monk in his cold scriptorium, the court artisan creating luxury manuscripts for a duke, the town scribe recording mundane legal transactions, you might reflect on how the same fundamental craft took such different forms depending on context and patronage. The skills were transferable, but the experience of the work varied enormously based on who you worked for and why. The wealthy patron's manuscript, with its elaborate illuminations and costly materials, might seem superior to the simple monastic copy. Certainly it was more beautiful, more impressive as an object. But both served purposes important to their respective communities. The luxury manuscript displayed wealth and taste, functioned as a status symbol, and yes, also provided a text for private devotion. The monastic manuscript preserved knowledge, supported religious life, and contributed to the monastery's library and educational mission. Neither type of work was inherently more valuable than the other. They were simply different, shaped by different priorities and possibilities. The secular scribe enjoyed comforts and compensation the monk did not. The monk enjoyed security and community the independent scribe might lack. Each made choices and accepted trade-offs inherent in their position. As evening settles over these various worlds of scribal labor, whether monastery, ducal workshop, or town office, imagine the scribes setting aside their work. The monk returns to chapel for vespers, then supper in the refectory, then compline before bed. The court scribe finishes his day's work and returns to his own dwelling, perhaps stopping at a tavern for wine and conversation. The manorial scribe closes his record book, locks the office, and walks home through darkening streets to his family. Each has spent the day doing fundamentally the same work writing with ink on parchment, producing texts that will outlast them. But their experiences of that work, the meanings they found in it, and the rewards they received for it differed profoundly. The manuscript as physical object might look similar whether produced in monastery or court workshop, but the human experience behind its creation varied enormously. And yet, 6 or 7 centuries later, when we examine these manuscripts in museums and libraries, we cannot always tell which were produced in which context. A beautifully written page is beautiful, regardless of whether the scribe was a monk working in cold silence or a professional, earning wages in a comfortable workshop. The text preserves knowledge regardless of the circumstances of its copying. The labor of long-dead hands speaks to us across the centuries, reminding us that patient, skilled work creates things that endure long after the worker is forgotten. And so we return to where we began, to the fundamental nature of the scribe's work, whether monastic or secular, whether copied onto new parchment or hidden beneath later texts, whether created in cold discomfort or relative comfort, whether done for spiritual devotion or material reward. The quiet, meticulous life of a medieval scribe was not dramatic. There were no battles won, no kingdoms conquered, no sudden revelations or moments of high adventure. There was only the patient accumulation of letters into words, words into lines, lines into pages, pages into manuscripts. There was the scratch of quill on parchment, the soft sound of pages turning, the rhythmic grinding of pigments, the endless silence broken only by wind, and the bells calling to prayer. Yet this quiet work preserved the knowledge of the ancient world and the devotion of the medieval one. These patient scribes, sitting at their slanted desks, working through cold mornings and dim afternoons, created the manuscripts that allow us to know what people thought and believed and valued in ages long past. Without them, history would be largely silent. Without their labor, vast portions of human learning and creativity would have been lost forever. Consider, as you drift toward sleep, the extraordinary patience this work required. To spend years on a single manuscript, as Edfrith did. To copy the same texts again and again, as working scribes did. To sit in cold silence for hours each day, maintaining perfect concentration despite discomfort and fatigue. To accept that your name would likely be forgotten, even as your work endured. There is something profoundly peaceful in contemplating this kind of dedication. In our modern world of speed and constant stimulation, of work that is visible and loudly celebrated, there is comfort in remembering that some of humanity's most important work was done quietly, slowly, patiently, by people whose names we will never know. The scriptorium offers a model of focused labor, of attention to craft, of work done not for recognition, but simply because it needs to be done and needs to be done well. The scribe could not rush, could not cut corners, could not produce careless work. Each letter had to be formed correctly. Each line had to be properly spaced. Each page had to meet exacting standards. There was a rightness to this work, a satisfaction in doing it properly, regardless of who would notice or appreciate the effort. As you lie in your bed, comfortable and warm in ways medieval scribes could only dream of, you might reflect on the cold stone rooms where they worked, the stiff fingers and aching backs they endured, the eye strain and the fatigue. You might feel gratitude for the ease with which we now create and distribute texts, for computers and printers that produce in seconds what once took months. But you might also feel a certain wistfulness for the deliberateness of their labor, for the way each manuscript was a significant achievement, each completed page a minor victory. There was meaning in the slowness, value in the difficulty. The manuscript mattered because it was so hard to create. The hidden texts lying beneath palimpsests remind us that nothing is ever truly lost while any trace remains. The luxury manuscripts commissioned by dukes and princes show us the heights that craft and artistry could reach when given resources and patronage. The humble administrative documents of manor courts demonstrate that not all writing was exalted. That much labor went to mundane but necessary purposes. All of these manuscripts, from the sublime to the functional, required the same basic process. A person sitting with parchment and quill, carefully forming letters, gradually creating text. The work was the same, even when the context differed. And in that work, repeated millions of times across centuries, the medieval world preserved itself for future ages to study and contemplate. Let yourself rest now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Imagine the quiet scriptorium at the end of the working day, the desks empty, the manuscripts carefully covered, the tools cleaned and stored. Outside the windows, darkness has fallen. The scribes have departed for their evening prayers or their homes. The room is silent except perhaps for the wind, the rain, the sounds of a world much quieter than our own. In that silence, the manuscripts wait. The pages of vellum, covered with careful script. The partially completed work that will be resumed tomorrow. The hidden texts beneath palimpsested surfaces, patient and persistent. The accumulated labor of countless hands, the concentrated effort of countless minds, all dedicated to the preservation and transmission of human knowledge and culture. The medieval scribe lived a life of routine, discipline, and patience. The work was demanding, often uncomfortable, sometimes tedious, but it was purposeful. It mattered, and it endured. As sleep approaches, let go of the need for speed, for stimulation, for constant change. Embrace instead the medieval scribe's patience, the willingness to work slowly toward distant goals, the acceptance of discomfort in service of meaningful purpose. There is rest in this mindset, peace in this patience. The scriptorium is empty now. The day's work is complete. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, more letters to form, more lines to copy, more pages to fill. But tomorrow is not yet here. For now, there is only the stillness of evening, the comfort of rest after labor, the deep satisfaction of having worked carefully and well. Sleep gently, knowing that some of humanity's most valuable work was done quietly, patiently, one letter at a time, by people who understood that meaning comes not from drama or recognition, but from steady dedication to craft and purpose. The quiet, meticulous life of a medieval scribe continues to speak to us across the centuries, not loudly, not insistently, but in a calm whisper that invites us to slow down, to concentrate, to find satisfaction in work done carefully and completely. Rest now. Let the scratch of quill on parchment fade into silence. Let the cold stone scriptorium fade into warmth and comfort. Let the centuries between then and now dissolve into the timeless space of sleep. The manuscripts endure. The scribes are at peace. And so may you be.